Hey there, everybody. Thank you for tuning into episode 6 of the Complete Solution Group. We're really honored today. We have a great guest, Chuck DeMore. Chuck is a retired Border Patrol agent, joined the patrol in the 80s, got a lot of great stories. And really, for us, for John and I being retired from ICE, John was also with the Border Patrol. This is just valuable information for us to help the rest of you listeners out there understand exactly what's going on at the border right now, because the border hasn't always been like this. It's definitely changed, and it's great to hear from guys in the past that were on the border in the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s that were really able to focus on what we're supposed to be focusing on the border, with stopping the drug trafficking, stopping the human smuggling, and really having an enforceable border for our national security. So we're really happy to welcome Chuck DeMore to the show. And hey, JP, you're going to kick it off since you're the former Border Patrol guy, and let's get it going.
Thanks a ton, man. That was a great intro for Chuck. And I met Chuck in 2009, and Chuck actually retired by then. And I only had, at that time, I think it was 12 years of service, 14 years of service, and Chuck was already retired. And I think, Fab, like you said, just to cut to the chase, it's going to be a fascinating story. I'm just going to turn over to Chuck. So, Chuck, the people who are going to be listening, can you just give them like a Reader's Digest version of your career? And then can we start back to how you actually became a Border Patrol agent and the rest of your career? Because you got to deal with things in the Reagan administration. You had to deal with 9/11. You had to deal with all these extraordinary events. And I think it'd be fascinating for the younger generation that are listening that kind of don't have this opportunity to talk to officers like yourself that just have a career. I mean, you were there when DHS was created. You were on the ground. So you saw all these great things that a lot of people just, get lost. I mean, it was over 20 years ago, all this stuff happened. And I've known you now for 14 years. And, our conversations, I didn't even realize half the stuff you did. And it's fascinating to me. And I know our listeners will be fascinated by it. So on that note, Chuck, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, John, I appreciate that. I grew up in Phoenix, and I'd say, during the early part of my life, I really didn't have much exposure to the border, being a couple of 100 miles away from it, or 170 or 80 miles from it, and didn't really have a lot of knowledge about or awareness about the kinds of things that were taking place down there. In the late 70s, very early 80s, I graduated. I got my master's degree up at Flagstaff at NAU, and I got a job at Arizona Western College teaching sociology and administration of justice. And this kind of leads into how I got into the service. My background was in sociology, and I had a real driving interest in demography, the study of populations and how people are moving around and all that kind of thing. So I got a job. I thought initially that I wanted to be a teacher, and so I got a job teaching at Arizona Western College. And as fate would have it, I had a couple of students in an administration of justice course that were Border Patrol agents, and because of their shift work and all that kind of thing, they would have to sometimes reschedule an exam or whatever. So I got to know them a little bit better than I would get to know the average student, I suppose. And one day, one of the agents asked me if I would be interested in doing a ride-along with him. And he said, "We don't have a program, but if you're interested, I'll take you out." And having this, historic interest in demography and the movement of peoples and all that kind of thing. And also, look, I recognized I was in my mid-20s, and I had basically spent my entire life going to school, trying to, get the information I would need to teach. And once I got out there teaching, I realized I didn't have a whole lot of real life experiences. So particularly as they relate to demography. So anyway, I took him up on that, and I went out one evening with one of the agents from Yuma sector, and I was shocked. I was just maybe shocked, maybe horrified might be even in the description. There were people crossing, in various unmanned places along our southern border, and I was living in Yuma, and I had no idea this kind of thing was taking place really right under my nose. So I spent 4 or 5 hours out with him on that evening, and that changed my life completely. I had spent 6 years in college preparing myself to teach and be a teacher. And one evening with this agent out in Yuma gave me kind of a perspective I had never seen before. And I thought, this is what I need to be doing. I need to be spending my time trying to better the situation as it exists on the border. And also I did recognize that if that doesn't fit into my a general comfort level over the years, I always can fall back on education, and the more I learn about demography, the better off I'll be. So I happened to see the recruiter a few weeks later or months later on campus as he was doing his recruitment stuff. And I said, I'll fill out one of those cards. I think it was a 5,000B or something like that. And I filled out the interest card. And a few months later, I got a letter in the mail asking me to inviting me to an interview in Yuma, which I went to. And after that, I got a written exam. And after that, I got an offer in 1983. I was spending the summer here in Phoenix waiting for the next school year in Yuma to start, and I would go back and do that. And I got a letter inviting me to join the 157th session of the United States Border Patrol Academy, of which I knew absolutely nothing about other than that one evening with the agent. And kind of, without any hesitation, I said, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to join. So I reached out to Arizona Western College. They very kindly allowed me out of the contract that I already signed for the next year. And on August 15th, 1983, I showed up at San Diego sector, where I was going to be duty posted for a couple of days en route to the academy in Georgia, where I would spend the next 4.5 months. Once I graduated from the Border Patrol Academy, that was December of 83, and entered on duty back at Brownfield Station, I found a remarkable set of circumstances there. Now, back in the 80s, there were in 1983, I looked this up, there were roughly 2,350 Border Patrol agents, actually less than that, 2,341, I think. And in 1984, it was less. It dropped by about 10. It was 2,333, I believe. Well, fast forward 25 years, 30 years, we've got 20,000, 22 or 3,000 agents on the border. And the border is more out of control today with 20,000 agents than it was in 1983 with 2,000 agents. So you have to do the math and wonder, how can that be? And in addition to that, the Border Patrol budget now, I think, is up around $4 billion a year. So we're spending infinitely more money to accomplish infinitely less. But to go back, I joined the Border Patrol, spent 5 years in uniform on the southern border in San Diego sector at Brown Field. In the 5 years I was at Brown Field, 5 agents were shot. So it tells you that border was a dangerous situation back then, and it's even worse today. But I spent 5 years in the Border Patrol and then transferred into investigations and went from the fire to out of the frying pan into the fire, because I went to Los Angeles in the anti-smuggling division, spent 6 years there, 3 as an agent, 3 as a supervisor. And there we saw the result of the relative uncontrolled border, much more controlled than today, but still it was not well controlled. And the people that were coming in ultimately were passing through Los Angeles, generally on their way to points all over the country. Spent 6 years in anti-smuggling and then transferred to Honolulu, Hawaii as the deputy director of that office. And I think we had about 400 employees in Hawaii. And the primary focus of the work there was in the inspections program. After 2 years in Hawaii, I transferred to San Francisco, where we later met, spent 2 years as the deputy director in San Francisco. Became the director and spent about 2 years as the director in San Francisco when 9/11 occurred. I had no interest in relocating at that time, but those decisions were well above my pay grade. So I got a call in the aftermath of 9/11 and was told that I'll be moving, transferring to headquarters. So in 2003, actually 2002, I transferred to headquarters as the assistant commissioner for investigations. So I was in charge of the investigations program. Spent about a year there. Well, actually, after about 3 or 4 months in Washington, I found out that the INS was going to be abolished and Homeland Security was going to be stood up. So I actually was the Homeland Security representative to the department's working group. I was the ICE representative to the department's working group on standing up ICE in the context of CIS and CBP. So after about a year and a half in headquarters, INS was abolished, Department of Homeland Security was stood up, and we went through the machinations of determining who would be duty posted where. And at that time, I was able to work out an arrangement with the then assistant secretary to come back to San Francisco, where I had been the director as the special agent in charge. So I came back as the SAC in 2004, I believe it was, retired in 2007. So that's kind of in a nutshell, my career.
And Chuck, just going back to when you're in the Border Patrol, what was, let's go even a little step further back, like at the academy. I mean, one, you were in your mid-20s, which is not that old, but as the academy, when I went in, it's not a young man's game. And, there was guys as young as 21 and as old as 35 going in. Mm-hmm. And in the late 90s, it was tough. And they always say the Border Patrol Academy was, they said it's either the toughest federal academy or the second behind the U.S. Marshals. What was it like when you were going in there? Because I don't think people understand the process going in, because the immigration law, as they say, is the second hardest law to learn in front of taxation law. But what was it like there? Because I know when I got in, our standards were dropped a little bit, and you guys had to learn so much and actually be able to memorize the jurat for your exams. I mean, could you kind of take us through that, from your academy?
Oh, yeah.
What was that like?
Well, I'll tell you how I kind of entertained that. When I went to the academy, I left what I consider to be a very good job, and one that I had prepared for 6 years, going to college and then graduate school. So when I went to the Border Patrol Academy, it was with the understanding that this is a non-failure possibility. I'm not going to allow myself to do anything except be successful here. And to that end, and this is no exaggeration, I studied 4 hours a night, Monday through Thursday. I took Friday off. I took Saturday off, and then I studied all day Sunday. So literally 4 hours a night during the week, and 1 full day on the weekend, and a half a day on Saturday. So it was a very, very difficult academy. I found it very difficult, and I had quite an academic experience in college. So the Spanish was, 3 or 4 hours a day, PT, and immigration law. And I want to say probably a third of the agents that were recruited back then did not make it out of the academy. Very frequently because of Spanish, sometimes because of the law, sometimes because of the PT. But there was very very high standards, high expectations, and strict governance. There was no room for anything other than doing it the way you were prescribed to do it. So I found the academy to be pretty tough, worked very hard at it. And I felt when I came out, I was very well prepared for the job that lied ahead, which is very different than the job that is now, on the plate of the agents that are working down on the border today. It's a disaster.
And Chuck, so once you get out of the academy, there's still 2 more exams to do. And I think a lot of people don't understand that is as a Border Patrol agent, you're kind of hired help. You're there for 4 or 5 months in the academy. When I went in, it was 20 weeks. You're there, and then you go back to your station. And then when I was in there, the maps were hand drawn. So now you have to learn the area orientation. Obviously, if there's sensor activity out there, where those are, and you have to learn traffic. And then on top of that, you have to continue your studies, because now you have to go for 2 more examinations at 6-month mark, a month after the academy, and a 10-month mark. What was that like? Because I think that's a lot of things, because just because we're working, you're still studying, there's still a post-academy session. And it's like for a Border Patrol agent, like you feel the pressure relieve off you after that year mark, because then you're on probation for that full year. So once you pass your 10-month, you still have 2 months to do the best you can so you don't get fired. And I think that's a lot of what, don't get me wrong, all these other law enforcement academies, I know they have post-academy, and I'm sure they have a time there where you have to be on probation, and after that you're off. But can you talk about that, about once you get out of the academy?
Oh, yeah. Well, obviously that's a super stressful period. I'm not aware of any other jobs that you have 2 examinations that are after your basic training, that if you fail either one, you're out of work. But that's the way it was back then. You had about a 4.5 month experience in the academy, and then you would go to your duty station and you would work out in the field under the supervision of a training officer for 4 days a week. And then on Friday of that week, you would spend in the classroom doing post-academy training. So that took place for another 6 weeks, so 4.5 months in the academy. You come back, you're working in the field 4 days a week under the supervision of a training officer. And then the 5th day, you're in a classroom, half of the day studying Spanish, half of the day studying law. Then after 6 months, after the 6-month period, so 4.5 in the academy, another month and a half in the field, you take a written exam and an oral exam. And if you fail either one, you are out, you're terminated. And those exams are not easy. And particularly for the non-native speakers to take the exams, and the Spanish exam was very, it was something that was very stressful for people having to do. And then you went through the same machinations 4 months later. So after your 6-month exam, you have 4 more months of Monday through Friday in the field under the supervision, Monday through Thursday in the field under the supervision of a training officer, and then Friday in the classroom. And then after you reach actually 10 months, you take your second exam, same thing, an oral and a written. If you fail either one, you're out. If you pass them both, then you have 2 more months of probation. And when you hit that 12-month mark, you have a job. And it was very, very stressful.
And also too, Chuck, so once you're out, now you're off probation. What did you see down there? I mean, obviously the border's not like it's now. It's not like you have thousands of people coming across. Also, too, there was no border wall. There was just some wire fence that may or may not be up. I mean, some of the border you just knew on that other side was Mexico. There was no barriers. And two, at the time, if you have on the shift in that part, you may have 5 or 10 guys that have maybe 50 square miles to cover. Right. So your support, your backup is non-existent. If you're lucky, someone's nearby. I mean, can you take us through that? So now you're done with your exams. You're out there patrolling. I imagine you probably have some exciting and probably close calls being out there, especially during that time.
Well, I can tell you that in the 80s, the work generally began when the sun went down, because in those days, the Border Patrol had control over the border, at least those areas where we had a physical presence. And literally, nobody crossed during the daylight hours. It would be very difficult to get through. And so they would wait until the sun would go down, and then it was a cat and mouse game. Literally thousands of people every night would try and come in, and we would catch, I think, the vast majority and send them back. And then we would repeat that the following day. I can remember a particular shift at Brown Field, which was one of, I think, 10 stations in San Diego sector at the time. In one 8-hour shift, we caught 800 people. 800 people in an 8-hour shift back then was unheard of. Now, literally all of those people were subsequently returned to Mexico. Probably 99.9% of those people were returned that night. Now you see people pouring across the border during all hours of the day with no fear of being apprehended. In fact, a desire to be apprehended, because it appears to me as though we have completely abdicated our responsibility on the border. We're a country of the people, by the people, for the people. And the people here like to feel like we have a hand in our own governance. And with respect to the border, I don't see that occurring. I mean, in my view, the average American probably is gravely concerned about the consequences of this open border. And rightfully so. I mean, when you abdicate your responsibility to patrol that border and to ensure its integrity, you compromise the institutions that are so basic to our own existence: education, medicine. People are coming in and taxing our schools, our hospitals, our roads. And I'm as empathetic as the next person. In fact, my background was sociology. I didn't come into this from a law enforcement perspective. I came into it from a kind of a more humanistic perspective. But if we think we're doing anyone a favor by leaving the border wide open, we're not. We're not doing a favor to those people that are coming in, because ultimately it's not sustainable, and they will not all be allowed to stay. And so we're creating an environment that puts more stress on this country, but also more stress on those folks that are coming here because they think it's an open border. And when they get here, they find out, frankly, now that it is. But at some point, when we regain control of this situation, I think there's going to be some consequences for those people that will not have been worth their journey here.
Hey Chuck, coming from that background, that sociology background, and initially going in and kind of having probably a little bit of a humanitarian heart when you first got on the patrol. After seeing what you saw with the human smuggling and the trafficking and the drugs pouring over the border, how did your outlook on that kind of change over time? And seeing exactly what you saw, like seeing how people were being used and the human smuggling and how people were being treated. Did you have like kind of this change of outlook a little bit?
Well, I mean, I'm still as empathetic as I've ever been, but I also have become more pragmatic, I suppose, in terms of just seeing the consequences of this unregulated, open border. And now, living in Arizona again, a border state, it just kind of strikes me as a little, not funny, but odd that when a few busloads of folks are sent back to Chicago or New York, it seems like it creates this firestorm where we have had literally thousands of people crossing our border every day for the last several years. And watching the news just this morning, they were reporting that thousands of adult male Africans are coming through at Lukeville. And I can tell you that in my 5 years in uniform on the border, and it's because it stuck out to me, I remember I only arrested one adult African male. And it's noteworthy because I remember it because it was unusual for us to get someone from Africa coming across the San Diego border, and now they're coming by the thousand. And again, the consequences are going to play out for many years, and I think it's unsustainable. There are ways to turn this around. As a practitioner who spent much of my adult life addressing this issue, I'm more fearful now than I've ever been that we're getting to a point where it'll be almost impossible to correct this if we don't do something soon. So it's a very dangerous position that we've allowed ourselves to be put into. And again, it's like the American people want to have a hand in their own governance. And I don't think the average American is either aware or, if fully aware, would endorse an open border. I think it's a minority of people that see that as viable or sustainable. And they've somehow managed to convince or at least represent to the masses that this is a strategy that will have positive benefits, but I don't think that's the case.
Yeah, I mean that's the unusual thing that we're seeing is we are seeing a segment of, especially of this administration, that has not acted on what's happening at the border. As someone like you who's been down to the border, worked on the border, knows what the border is all about. I mean, to all three of us, I mean, we've been in that situation. We know what the border is supposed to be like, but the average person may not, and they may think that this is just a natural migration pattern that occurs every year. And look, we do have those. I mean, we do have these migration patterns where, like you said, it used to be mostly people from Mexico, from Central America, from South America. They'd have these patterns. They'd come up during certain times of the year. Many of them would go back home after they made a certain amount of money and then come back again when the farms were kicking up. That's not what is happening at the border now. This is chaos at the border. The Border Patrol is overwhelmed, even with the number of Border Patrol agents they got down there, which is not enough for what they're dealing with. It's just an overwhelming feeling. And John and I have, since we retired a year ago, we've been down to the border multiple times. And, just being down there, the two of us who have seen the border in the last few years, seeing exactly what's happening, seeing these masses of people from Africa, people from China, people from India, from Bangladesh. It's a massive, overwhelming migrant surge across
Yes.
our border. And it's just, as for someone, who's seeing it in Arizona, do you see, can you see that this administration is actually not doing something about that? I mean, can you speak to that?
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, until this last 3 years, I shouldn't say until, not categorically, the last 3 years have been an absolute disaster. We have sent the messaging from the administration appears to be, if you can get here, you can get in. And they do this under the guise of seeking to give refuge to these people who are refugees and seeking asylum. But the realities are that when you're seeking asylum, at least my remembrance is that you're required to seek it from the first safe country that you pass through. And these people are not doing that. They're country shopping, which is they are coming to America. And if they leave from Africa and transit through 8 different countries, all of which are safe havens, and do not file for asylum until they get here, that's manipulating the system. We shouldn't allow that, but we are. Secondly, I've got a lot of experience over the years working in the asylum program. I've just seen the standards at times be relaxed to the point where they're approving cases that are, frankly, should not be approved. And I think now we're entertaining asylum applications from people who are not legitimate asylees. They're economic refugees. And again, I'm as empathetic as anyone to the plight that these people are enduring. But I believe that our generosity as a nation should extend beyond our borders, but it should start at home. And we have plenty of poor Americans. We have plenty of homeless Americans. We have homeless veterans. We have people that have dedicated their lives to working in a way to preserve our own national, integrity, and now they're living either hand to mouth or sometimes homeless. So, I mean, I would rather see us control our borders, have a very robust but controlled immigration protocol that allows people to come in. When you allow massive in-migration in a short period of time, you do not give the people that are coming in an opportunity to acculturate, to become Americans, to develop that American culture and spirit, so that when they play the national anthem at the ball game, you get goosebumps. You've got them, I've got them. We know what that feels like because we love our country. And when you allow hundreds of thousands of people, millions potentially, to pour in a short period of time, you're creating enclaves of people whose value systems are not consistent necessarily or frequently with our value systems. And again, I just think that our generosity ought to start at home.
And Chuck, Fab just mentioned, and you're just talking about that, about the administrations, how there's this facade, border secure, don't worry about it. Under Obama's administration, Jay Johnson said a bad day is 1,000 encounters. Now I think we're up to 12,000, 13,000 encounters a day. And there's just like this, don't worry about it. It's all smoke and mirrors. Like now the border's secured. Going back to when you were in with the Reagan administration, how was that administration towards immigration? Like, did you get this? Like, I feel like at every turn with immigration, we're hamstrung. It's stop doing your job. Instead of deterring them, accept them, transport them, process them, and just keep coming in. I mean, under Reagan, what was that like?
Well, I think the agents, by and large, had a great deal of pride in what they were doing, and I feel like we had a great deal of respect for the administration supporting what we were trying to accomplish. I think my remembrances of working in the days of Ronald Reagan are very favorable, very positive. In many regards, not only the border, but he seemed to be very strong on national security in all aspects. And the border was simply one component of a kind of a mosaic of security configurations. And the border was, it wasn't totally secure, but it was under control. It was kind of a controlled chaos, if you will. People weren't coming in to give up because they knew that if they did, or if they got caught, the chances were very good that they would be going back home. And now there's none of that. And there are ways to easily accomplish what we need to accomplish. It's just that there doesn't appear to be, at this time, a political will to do that. There doesn't seem to be a political will to restrict unlawful immigration, to restrict immigration in general to a number that is manageable and sustainable over time. This is not, 1620 anymore. I mean, it's a different country. It's a different world. There are many dangerous things out there that we need to protect our citizens from. And the government, to me, at least in my view, does not now seem to be doing the kinds of things that are protecting the American people's interests over the long term. And I think over the long term, we got a lot of troubles ahead of us. Just think of the last 3 years, how many hundreds of thousands or potentially millions of people have illegally crossed that border. And if only a small percentage of them are intent on doing us harm, and I can almost guarantee you there is a percentage of these people that will want to do us harm, they can do a lot of damage. Absolutely. And to me, it's just reprehensible, unacceptable that our borders are open, particularly living right down here and seeing this. It's changed the complexion of our country. And I think, we're seeing some problems in Europe that have a genesis in their lack of immigration control, a strategy for growth in a controlled manner. And they're suffering the consequences. Yeah. And if we're not careful, we'll be doing the same.
We've seen it in France. I mean, if we want to see a blueprint for what's going to happen, I mean, France has had the riots with the migrants. Mm-hmm. There have been problems in England. You have a whole island down in southern part of Italy that's been taken over by migration. They've come over 5 times the amount of the population that was previously living there. And, you mentioned something a little bit earlier. It's manageable and sustainable. And I think those are 2 unbelievably great points about that. What's happening now is not manageable. It is definitely not sustainable. And if we continue on this path forward, we're only going to see more problems occurring. I tell everyone, I look at this as a chaos loop. Like what I believe is happening is the Biden administration has created what's called a chaos loop, which means as things start to happen, more bad things start to happen because of what the initial reaction was. So the initial reaction of the border not being controlled has allowed these people to enter the United States and then go to these cities and communities where they believe that they were going to find a job, they were going to find housing, and they were going to be taken care of. But they're getting to these cities and they're winding up homeless. So where this chaos loop continues is now they wind up homeless in these cities. They're not getting food. They have no money. As you know, as a law enforcement guy, that starts us thinking, what does that lead young men to do if they can't get food, they have no job, they have no housing? They're only going to lead them to, in order to make money, in order to survive, crime. And they're going to get angry. They're going to riot. They're going to commit crimes because they've been put into this situation where the chaos keeps perpetuating and it only leads to worse situations. So I think you knocked it out of the ballpark, manageable and sustainable, and we're not seeing that.
No, and I think, it's manifests itself in so many ways. Some you would expect and some you wouldn't. And one is just the morale of the agents. I mean, you have a large bureaucracy, thousands and thousands of agents out on the streets, so to speak, every day. When I was a Border Patrol agent, I was proud of what I did. Felt that I was doing something that added to the value of our nation, the security of our country. And when I got up in the morning, I mean, it sounds corny, but I got up in the morning, I put that uniform on, and I'm sure you did too, John, and you polished that badge, and you felt proud of what you were doing. And now I don't think those agents could find much pride in the work they're doing, changing diapers and just shuttling groups of people back and forth between station and bus depots. And it's a bad situation. The morale is terrible. The agents don't feel respected, for one thing, but they're not empowered to do what they're legally responsible for doing. So the agency has, in my view, suffered some serious serious hits.
And Chuck, you said morale. I mean, right now there's actually going to be two crises. You have the migration coming in that's not stopping. I mean, it's just getting amplified more and more. And then on top of that, you have the morale of the Border Patrol where they're leaving in droves. They decide that no one has our back. They're overworked. They're just, miserable, and they realize no one has their back. And now that we're hearing some of these guys say, hey, I'm just going to go back home to be a cop, a sheriff, go back to school, get an education. So with the next administration coming in, whoever that is, they're going to have a mess on their hands.
Oh, yeah.
Now, because now they're going to say, hey, let's shut down the border. And I think they can literally do that very quickly, working with the government of Mexico. And also, too, we always forget, you have Canada up there, too, where the border has seen a 550% increase. And prior to 9/11, there was only 300 Border Patrol agents from the state of Washington to the state of Maine. There was nobody up there. And now there's this, like Fab said, this cycle of chaos where they're telling the northern agents, you need to go to the southern border to help them, with what's going on. But at the same time, the northern border is getting invaded. And then you look on our coast out in Puerto Rico and in Miami, they're getting invaded, by the boats coming out there. And even in the West Coast, as you know, down San Diego, LA, even up in San Francisco, we heard those Ponga boats making up to the Red River, which is up in Sonoma. So the country is literally getting invaded from all these different angles. But the only thing you see in the media is like Lukeville, Arizona, Eagle Pass. And at the time, a couple of years ago, there was Del Rio. But I think a lot of people, lose the fact that the northern border is getting overrun. Our coast, Puerto Rico, Miami, here by Tijuana at the coast, there's Ponga boats landing in Laguna Beach and people jumping out. And it makes you wonder, who are these people? And what is it that they're so scared of? They don't want to get apprehended. And it's well coordinated where once they land, there's a Suburban or something waiting for them to pick up. It's crazy. I mean, that's the biggest fear for me. And it's one of the reasons why we got this podcast together is to just bring awareness. Like when it comes to politics, you're either going to vote for who you think is going to do the job or not. I don't think so. But seeing what you see in the media, I don't think it does justice. And also, too, with the morale of these Border Patrol agents and also the ICE officers, HSI, ERO, and everybody else. Now you're hearing the air marshals are pulled off of planes to send down to help. What is an air marshal going to do at the border? And now you hear here, I'm sure, Chuck, as you're aware, the governor here, Katie Hobbs, says, I'm going to activate the National Guard. Where are they? The Border Patrol is still overrun. There's no National Guard in sight. You had the Tohono O'odham Reservation there. I mean, it's literally the chaos, as Fab said, is I think is worse than most people can imagine.
Well, I think it's much worse than anybody can imagine. And frankly, I don't know why people are even trying the Ponga boats or all these more difficult paths, because all you have to do is make it to the border and self-surrender, and you're in. I mean, there's no one holding people back. And there doesn't appear to be any real effort to return people who have no equities here and have no right to be here. It's absurd. It is tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and maybe millions of people crossing our border. I was listening to the news last night, and the guy said, in 1 month, we've let in as many people as there are in like Cincinnati or Lexington, Kentucky. I mean, it's these huge cities are popping up. Literally, theoretically, it's the same numbers, but these tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people coming a month, and they generally don't bring any real work skills that are applicable to our, economy, or bring in any assets that are going to be a value here. They come, unfortunately, with very little, and it's costing us just incredible amounts of money. And again, it's not sustainable. I mean, it's taxing our hospitals, our jails, our roads, our schools. And when schools only move at the pace of the slowest student, and your students up here, but the students that came here from, non-native English-speaking countries are back here, the instructor's required to keep the level such that they can also participate. So your kids are sliding back as they slowly move forward. It's just a mess, and it's across the board. Go to DMV and you stand in line for a long time to get your license because maybe there are 15 people ahead of you that are not even legally in the country, but the states have decided to give them licenses. So, I mean, it's impacting Americans in ways you don't even think about, and it's going to continue to get worse. And there will be, in my view, there will be some very serious consequences that we can't even anticipate right now. What's going to happen? I mean, you know, we didn't all live through 9/11. We lived through 9/11. Many of your, you know, constituents lived through 9/11. But if you think back now, it was in 22, 23 years ago. So there are young adults today who didn't live through it, who don't appreciate the vulnerabilities that we all share. And let's face it, you know, Americans are not the most beloved people around the world, or at least in many parts of the world. And our enemies have made no mistake about telling us that they want to come after us. And when you give them an avenue to do that and then expect them not to take advantage of it, you're being a bit naive, I think.
Yeah, absolutely, Chuck. You know, one of the things is, and I've heard you say this before, there's no fear by anybody about entering the United States illegally. Like, they know they're not going to be put in custody. Like, a lot of the people who used to enter illegally feared getting caught by the Border Patrol or by ICE because they knew they were going to get put in custody. They were going to sit inside detention until they had their removal hearing, and then they were going to get deported. So there was that, that corrective action that was there for the illegal opportunity that they took, and they feared that. There isn't that fear now, and they're not afraid to enter illegally and approach a Border Patrol agent. Or in the past, they'd be trying to get away from a Border Patrol agent, but now they're approaching them, claiming false asylum. They've all been scripted to say, I have danger in my country. I fear for my life. You know, and we've heard them say this. I watched Bill Maloogian today on Fox News. He interviewed some guys from India. And originally when he started talking to them, he was saying, well, why'd you come to America? And they were saying, oh, money, money, money. And then one of the guys from India stood up and looked at all those other guys, gave them all a look. And he said, we fear for our lives. And then all the other guys shut up and they stopped talking about the money things because they knew that, oh, crap, we're on the news. We all just said we were here for money. And then the one guy reminded them what they're supposed to be saying. You know, and so there's not that fear factor.
No.
How? I mean, what do you have anything to say about that?
I will tell you that fear factor has potentially been diminished for longer than we'd all like to think. I can remember in the early 90s going to the Punjab with one Indian investigator. And the purpose of that trip was to try and ascertain how much integrity our asylum process had with respect to people coming from the Punjab. So we took 10 approved asylum cases and went to it. These were people that had already come to the U.S., already been granted asylum, and now the families were preparing to follow to join. And we went up to the Punjab and we interviewed 9. We tried to find 10 different, we took 10 cases to try and investigate. We found 9 of the families, and we found that of those 9 families, all 9 were fraudulently they're all based in fraud. I mean, the people that had come to the U.S. had lied to get asylum granted, and now the family members were seeking to join them. And we found 9 cases, all were fraudulent, but ultimately nothing was done. So I think that was kind of just a little look into the process to see how much integrity there was, and we found there was not as much as there needed to be. That was even back then. Now there's none. There's no integrity to the process. Nobody cares about getting away. They don't want to get away. The only ones I guess who get away are just the ones that come beyond the capacity of the Border Patrol to grab these people, and the rest, there's nowhere to, no one to catch them or no one to house them, no one to.
And those few that have entered illegally before know they have a record that the Border Patrol is going to pick up, so they don't want to get picked up themselves because we are removing 11.9% of those that we encounter. So the Border Patrol is removing some people. That was last year's fiscal year, 11.9% they removed immediately. But Chuck, we've got about 5 more minutes. We'd love to have you back on. I just think you're a wealth of knowledge. You got history is an important thing. We need to look at historical aspect of where we came from and where we're going. But for this episode, to just close out in the next 4 or so minutes, Like do you see there being a change, and how can we enact that change? What needs to happen to get back into the border back in and
Well,
in control, have operational sustainability, good management, and control the border?
there has to be a disincentive to come here illegally. Otherwise, people will continue to pour in. So you've got to have the capacity to stop people at the border, to vet them, to detain those that need to be detained prior to a hearing to determine if they're going to be allowed to stay. And once you do that, you need to make sure that your hearings have integrity and that only people who should be allowed to stay are allowed to stay. So I think if, over the years, people have said, oh, we've got so many millions of people here now that shouldn't be here. It's going to be impossible to remove them all. Well, I don't disagree with that. It's not impossible. It's probably unfeasible and economically would be undoable. But I think what we need to do is create an environment here that is a little bit less comfortable for people than it would be for them in their own homeland, and let them go back on their own volition, and maybe even provide some support to do that. I mean, I think we have to think outside the box. We want these people to go back home. Maybe there are ways to give them incentives to do that. We don't need to buy 50,000 more trucks and vans and buses and 50,000 more agents and go out and terrorize communities by trying to, no, we implement protocols in our government that manifest in people leaving of their own volition, because I suspect that many of these people don't really want to be in the United States. They just want some financial security. And if we can find ways to work with their host countries, find ways to get them to go back on their own, we'd be in a lot better shape. And it's money better spent than having agents run around the interior of the United States trying to, grab people off the street. That's my view anyway. I think we just need to find a way to get people to go back on their own. And I think that's very viable. I think that's very doable. And we need to enforce the laws that are on the books. We need to put the governance of America back in the hands of the American people through their elected representatives, and not tolerate people who we elect and send to Washington that turn their backs on us. Don't do what they've told us that they'll do and what we've directed them to do, So I think it's time for some real change, and hopefully we're on the precipice of it.
And Chuck, just to close out too, so we only got to your career in the Border Patrol. We haven't even gone up to LA yet. So in the next episode, we'll pick up in LA and see what happens. I mean, we still have some big events to talk about: 9/11, formation of DHS, and your times in Hawaii. And I just want to close out real quick. I was just doing some research. Back in the early 80s, there was 3 Border Patrol movies that came out in succession. In 1980 was Borderline with Charles Bronson. Do you remember seeing that movie?
Yeah, I remember seeing it.
And then after that, there was The Border with Jack Nicholson, who was down in El Paso. And then the last one was Flashpoint with Chris Christopherson and Treat Williams down there. I was going to say, in your opinion, I'm just curious, out of those 3 movies, which one would you say would be the most accurate depiction of the Border Patrol?
I don't know if any of them were accurate. There was a time, though, when I think Border Patrol agents were generally respected and found to be, good citizens and contributing members of communities. And over the last few years, seems as the Border Patrol has been pretty demonized. And my experiences, the patrol, are just like my experiences in life. 95% of the people are great people who are compassionate, kind, and do their job with a lot of empathy. So I think it's time we restore some integrity to the Border Patrol, give those folks something to be proud of again, not ashamed of, which is what I think they are now. We've turned our backs on them. We don't fund them. We don't empower them. And we're seeing the consequences of that. There's no control of our border right now, and it's got to stop. This open border has got to stop.
Thanks a lot, Chuck, and you have a wonderful holiday. Merry Christmas, and we hope to talk to you soon again.
Merry Christmas and happy holidays to you guys.